Stand on Maryland's eastern shore and close your eyes. Picture 1849. A woman walks alone through darkness, following the North Star. Her name is Araminta Ross, but she'll soon become known as Harriet Tubman. She's 27 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and she has a secret that could kill her at any moment. She falls asleep without warning, struck down by seizures from a 2-pound iron weight that cracked her skull when she was just 12 years old. She escaped slavery that fall, alone, no guide, no map, just the stars and an unshakable conviction that she deserved to be free. When she crossed into Pennsylvania, she later said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything." But here's what makes Harriet Tubman different from almost every other freedom seeker who made it north. She went back again and again and again. Most people don't know the real Harriet Tubman. They know a simplified version, the Underground Railroad lady who helped some slaves escape. That's not wrong, but it's like calling George Washington a guy who crossed a river once. The truth is far more extraordinary. Harriet Tubman was a guerrilla fighter, a military commander, a spy who operated behind enemy lines, and one of the most successful freedom fighters in American history. She personally rescued more than 70 enslaved people across approximately 13 missions into slave territory, never losing a single passenger. She conducted intelligence operations for the Union Army, and in 1863, she became the first woman in United States history to plan and lead an armed military raid, liberating more than 700 people in a single night. This is her real story. Harriet Tubman was born around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, as Araminta Ross. Her parents called her Minty. She was one of 9 children born to Harriet Green and Benjamin Ross, both enslaved. The Brodus family, who claimed ownership of her mother, rented young Minty out to other enslavers who put her to work before she was even old enough to understand what freedom meant. Her childhood was brutal. She was whipped. She was beaten. She was forced to check muskrat traps in freezing marshes even after contracting measles, becoming so sick she nearly died. She wore extra layers of clothing to protect herself from the whip. When she was rented out as a child, she would run away for days at a time, hiding in a pig pen, eating scraps meant for the animals just to escape the violence. But the incident that would define her life happened when she was about 12 years old. She was at a dry goods store in Bucktown when an enslaved young man ran in, trying to escape. His overseer followed, enraged, and demanded that Minty help restrain the fugitive. She refused. She stood in the doorway, blocking the overseer's path. In his fury, the overseer grabbed a 2-pound iron weight and hurled it at the fleeing man. It hit Minty instead, right in the forehead. Her skull fractured. She was bleeding, unconscious, and left for dead. They gave her no medical treatment. After 2 days, they sent her back to the fields, blood still dripping from her head as she worked. The injury should have killed her. It didn't, but it changed her forever. For the rest of her life, Tubman suffered from what modern doctors believe was post-traumatic narcolepsy, caused by traumatic brain injury. She would fall asleep without warning, sometimes in the middle of a sentence. She'd wake up minutes or hours later and continue the conversation as if nothing had happened. She had debilitating headaches. She experienced vivid visions, lights, sounds, voices, sensations of fire on her skin. She interpreted these as messages from God. Think about what this means. The woman who would become the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, who would guide terrified people through pitch-black forests and hostile territory, could fall unconscious at any moment. And she did it anyway. As Tubman grew older and stronger, she was assigned to work in the timber fields alongside her father, Ben Ross. This is where she learned the skills that would save her life and the lives of dozens of others. She learned to read the woods. She learned to navigate by the stars. She learned which plants were edible, which could be used for medicine. She learned to move silently through the forest at night. She learned the rivers, the marshes, the hiding places. She became an expert at reading people, knowing who could be trusted, who couldn't. In 1844, when she was around 22, she married a free black man named John Tubman. She changed her name from Araminta to Harriet, taking her mother's first name, but marriage to a free man didn't make her free. Under the laws of slavery, her status followed her mother's status. She was still enslaved. Any children she had would be enslaved, and she could be sold at any moment. In 1849, her worst fears nearly came true. Her enslaver, Edward Brodess, died, leaving his widow Eliza deeply in debt. Enslaved people were property, and property could be sold to pay debts. Word spread that Tubman and her brothers were going to be sold to the Deep South, a death sentence. Being sold down the river meant being separated from family forever, sent to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, where enslaved people were quite literally worked to death. Tubman and two of her brothers, Ben and Henry, made a run for it in September 1849. But her brothers got scared and turned back, forcing Tubman to return with them. Days later, Tubman made a decision that would change American history. She would try again, alone. Before she left, she couldn't tell anyone directly. It was too dangerous. So she sang. She sang a farewell song, hoping her mother and the people she loved would understand. I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound for the promised land. Then she disappeared into the night. The exact route of Tubman's escape isn't known. She was smart enough never to discuss the details while the Underground Railroad was still operating. But historians have pieced together the general path. She traveled by night, navigating by the North Star. She likely followed the Choptank River northeast through Delaware and into Pennsylvania. She moved through Quaker communities who were active in helping freedom seekers. She hid in the woods during the day. She posed as a field worker when she had to move in daylight. She had contacts, free black people and white abolitionists who ran stations on the Underground Railroad, hiding fugitives and passing them along to the next safe house. The journey was about 90 miles. It took weeks. Every moment of it, she was a fugitive with a price on her head. If she'd been caught, she would have been dragged back in chains, probably beaten nearly to death as a warning to others, and then sold to the Deep South anyway. But she made it. When Harriet Tubman crossed into Pennsylvania, she was free for the first time in her life. She was 27 years old. She later described the moment. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. She settled in Philadelphia and got work as a cook and domestic laborer. She met William Still, one of the Underground Railroad's most important station masters, who would help hundreds of freedom seekers reach the North. Tubman learned the networks, the safe houses, the codes. She saved money, and then in December 1850, barely a year after her own escape, she heard devastating news. Her niece, Keziah Jolly, and Keziah's 2 young children were about to be sold at auction in Cambridge, Maryland. Most people who escaped slavery never went back. Why would they? They'd risked everything to get free. Going back meant risking capture, torture, and a return to bondage. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to stay in Philadelphia and build a new life. Harriet Tubman went back anyway. She traveled to Baltimore and worked with Keziah's husband, John Bowley, who was a freedman and a skilled boatman. They hatched a plan. At the auction, Bowley placed the highest bid on his own wife and children. But before anyone could figure out what was happening, he spirited them away to a hiding place. Then he sailed them by boat to Baltimore, where Tubman was waiting. She hid them for several days, then guided them along the Underground Railroad to Philadelphia. It was the first of approximately 13 rescue missions Tubman would conduct over the next decade, and it established the pattern she would follow: meticulous planning, inside information from a network of informants, bold action, and an absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. Let's be clear about what these missions entailed. Tubman was a fugitive slave. There was a $100 bounty on her specifically from when she first escaped. Later, there were persistent stories about larger bounties, $12,000, even $40,000. Modern historians have found no documentary evidence of these massive rewards, though the myth itself tells you something important. Slave catchers desperately wanted to capture the person they suspected was helping enslaved people disappear. Every trip Tubman made into Maryland was a potential death sentence. She traveled on foot, mostly at night, in all seasons. She carried a pistol. She used disguises, sometimes dressing as an old woman, sometimes as a man. She couldn't read or write, so she couldn't leave written instructions or messages. She communicated through songs, using spirituals like "Go Down Moses" to signal whether it was safe to move or dangerous to proceed. She memorized safe houses and routes. She learned to trust her instincts about people. She became known as Moses because, like the biblical Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, she was leading her people out of bondage. The title wasn't an exaggeration. Between 1850 and 1860, over the course of about 13 missions, Tubman personally guided approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom, including her parents, her brothers, and numerous friends and family members. She also provided instructions and intelligence to another 50 to 60 people who escaped on their own. Her most famous statement about her work: "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." Think about that. 0 failures, 0 losses. Over a decade of operating in hostile territory, with slave catchers actively hunting for her, with the constant risk of betrayal, with her own disability that could incapacitate her without warning, she never lost a single person. Some of her rescues are the stuff of legend. On one mission, she returned for her husband John, only to discover he'd remarried and didn't want to leave. She shrugged it off and rescued other people instead. On another mission, one of the escapees panicked and wanted to turn back. Tubman pulled out her pistol, pointed it at his head, and said, "You go on or die." She knew that if he returned and was tortured, he'd reveal the routes and safe houses, endangering everyone. He kept moving. Tubman used clever tactics to avoid capture. Slaveholders knew she was illiterate, so when she needed to move through a town during the day, she'd carry a book and pretend to read it. She'd board trains heading south when slave catchers would expect fugitives to head north. She moved on Saturdays because runaway advertisements wouldn't be published in newspapers until Monday, giving her a 2-day head start. By 1860, Tubman had rescued her elderly parents. Her father, Ben Ross, had been freed years earlier, but was suspected of helping freedom seekers and faced arrest. Tubman built a makeshift carriage and transported both her parents, elderly and unable to make the journey on foot, all the way to Canada, and later to Auburn, New York, where she purchased a home from William Seward, who would become Lincoln's Secretary of State. Her reputation in abolitionist circles was extraordinary. Frederick Douglass, himself a famous fugitive slave and orator, wrote about her with deep admiration. "I have had the applause of the crowd, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scared, and footsore bondmen. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom." When John Brown, the radical abolitionist, met Tubman in 1858, he was so impressed that he called her General Tubman. He wanted her help planning his raid on Harper's Ferry. Tubman supported Brown's goals, but ultimately didn't participate in the raid. She was ill at the time. It's one of history's great what-ifs. If Tubman had been at Harper's Ferry, would the outcome have been different? Then came 1861. The Civil War exploded across America, and Harriet Tubman saw an opportunity. She could do more than rescue people 13 at a time. She could help destroy the institution of slavery itself. In early 1862, Massachusetts Governor John Andrew, a fierce abolitionist who knew of Tubman's Underground Railroad work, recruited her for a critical mission. Union forces had captured Port Royal and the Sea Islands of South Carolina early in the war. When Federal troops arrived, white plantation owners fled in panic, abandoning approximately 10,000 enslaved people. These people were suddenly free, but destitute, traumatized, with nowhere to go and no resources. They flooded Union camps. Governor Andrew asked Tubman to go to South Carolina to help. She agreed. In her words, he told her to act as a spy, scout, or nurse, as the circumstances required. Tubman arrived in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1862. Initially, she worked as a nurse and teacher, helping newly freed people adjust to freedom, treating sick and wounded soldiers. She used remedies she'd learned from her mother, boiling roots and herbs to make medicines that treated dysentery, malaria, and other diseases ravaging the troops. Her medical skills became legendary. Soldiers who were dying by the dozens from disease began to recover under her care. But nursing wasn't Tubman's only role. She was perfectly positioned to do something the Union Army desperately needed: gather intelligence behind Confederate lines. Think about Tubman's qualifications for espionage. She was a black woman in a slave society, largely invisible to white Confederates who wouldn't imagine she could be a military asset. She'd spent a decade infiltrating hostile territory. She knew how to move without being detected. She knew how to read terrain. She knew how to read people. She could gain the trust of enslaved people who had crucial information about Confederate positions, supply lines, and defenses. And she was absolutely fearless. Tubman recruited a network of scouts and spies, black men who could navigate the rivers, speak the local guerrilla dialect, and gather information from plantations throughout the South Carolina Lowcountry. Men like Charles Simmons and Samuel Hayward, river pilots who knew every current and sandbar. Men like William Plowden, who sailed up the Combahee River on reconnaissance missions and returned with detailed intelligence on Confederate positions, bridges, troop strength, and the locations of underwater mines the Confederates had planned to sink Union boats. In May 1863, a freedom seeker named Francis Izard escaped from a plantation near the Combahee River and made his way to Union lines in Beaufort. He provided Tubman and Union commanders with precise information about where the Confederates had placed torpedoes, underwater mines, in the river. Other escapees followed, bringing more intelligence about fortifications, gun emplacements, and troop movements. By June 1863, Tubman and her spy network had built a complete picture of Confederate defenses along the Combahee River. Union commanders decided to strike. The objectives? Destroy Confederate supply depots and rice plantations that were feeding the Confederate Army, recruit freed men into the Union Army, and liberate every enslaved person they could reach. This was the Combahee River Raid, and Harriet Tubman was going to lead it. Colonel James Montgomery was chosen to command the operation. Montgomery was a hardened guerrilla fighter who'd battled pro-slavery forces in Kansas before the war. He commanded the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a regiment of black soldiers, many of them formerly enslaved men who'd been freed by the Union advance. Montgomery had about 300 men from the 2nd South Carolina, plus a detachment from the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery to man the gunboat's cannons. But Montgomery wanted Tubman to guide the operation. He trusted her intelligence network. He knew she had the respect of the local black community in ways no white officer ever could, and he knew she'd proven herself time and again under pressure. On the evening of June 1st, 1863, 3rd Union gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, left Beaufort and headed for the Combahee River. Tubman was aboard, along with Montgomery and the troops. The Sentinel ran aground in St. Helena Sound, forcing its troops to transfer to the other boats. Around 2:30 in the morning on June 2nd, the remaining gunboats reached the mouth of the Combahee River. Thanks to Tubman's scouts, they knew exactly where the underwater mines were planted. The boats navigated around them, moving upriver in darkness. Tubman had sent word through her network to enslaved people on the plantations. Freedom was coming. Be ready. As the boats moved upriver, Confederate pickets spotted them and fled to sound the alarm. But by then it was too late. Union troops landed at multiple points. They torched rice mills, storehouses, and plantation mansions. They destroyed bridges and supply depots. They blew apart a pontoon bridge with cannon fire. Confederate defenders scrambled to respond, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. And then the enslaved people began to run. From every direction, men, women, and children came running toward the gunboats. They'd been working in the rice fields when they heard the boats coming. Some plantation overseers fled. Others tried to stop the exodus but were overwhelmed. Hundreds of people, families, individuals, the elderly children, rushed toward the river, toward freedom, toward the boats. It was chaos. More than 700 people trying to board 2 gunboats. Women carrying children, some carrying pots and pans, chickens, pigs, whatever they could grab. The boats couldn't hold everyone at once. Some people swam out to the boats. Others crowded onto the docks. The scene was pandemonium. And then Tubman did something extraordinary. She went out on the deck and started singing. She sang "Come Along," a spiritual from the abolitionist movement. She sang in a voice everyone could hear, a voice of authority and calm. The crowd recognized her, not as a Northern officer giving orders, but as one of them, someone who'd been enslaved, someone who understood. The chaos settled. The loading became organized. Everyone got aboard. By the time the gunboats turned back toward Beaufort, more than 750 enslaved people had been liberated. Not a single Union soldier was killed or seriously wounded. The only casualty Tubman mentioned later was her dress. It had been torn by desperate hands grabbing at her as people boarded the boats. The military impact was devastating to the Confederacy. The raid destroyed multiple rice plantations, including estates owned by prominent secessionists. It wiped out stores of cotton, food, and military supplies the Confederate Army badly needed. It demolished infrastructure. It freed a massive workforce the South depended on. And immediately, about 100 of the freed men joined the Union Army. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers gained dozens of new recruits who had personal reasons to fight against the Confederacy. A Wisconsin newspaper reported on the raid, describing how Montgomery's gallant band of 300 soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton and lordly dwellings, and striking terror to the heart of rebeldom, brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property, without losing a man or receiving a scratch. The article didn't name Tubman. It called her the Black Woman and She Moses. But in July 1863, Franklin Sanborn, editor of Boston's Commonwealth newspaper, picked up the story and named Harriet Tubman directly. Her cover was blown. Her spy career was effectively over. Everyone now knew what she'd been doing. But the Combahee River Raid had accomplished something profound. It proved that black troops could fight effectively in combat. It proved that guerrilla tactics could devastate the Confederate war effort. It proved that the enslaved people of the South would fight for their own freedom, if given the chance. And it made Harriet Tubman the first woman in United States history to plan and lead an armed military operation. Let that sink in. Not the first black woman, the first woman, period. In the entire history of the United States military, Harriet Tubman was the first female civilian to lead troops into battle. After the Combahee Raid, Tubman continued working for the Union Army. She scouted, she spied, she nursed the wounded. She worked at Fort Monroe in Virginia, treating sick and injured black soldiers. She stayed in the South through most of the war, only leaving when her health began to fail in 1864. She returned in March 1865 to treat the wounded after major battles, and stayed until after Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April. Here's the bitter irony. Despite everything Tubman did, despite the lives she saved, the missions she led, the military victories she made possible, the United States government paid her exactly $200 for her entire service during the Civil War. $200 for years of work as a nurse, scout, and spy. After the war, Tubman returned to Auburn, New York. She married a Civil War veteran named Nelson Davis. She tried to get compensation from the government for her wartime service. She submitted affidavits. She got letters of support from officers who'd served with her. General Rufus Saxton wrote, "She made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity." Congress refused. Some members objected to paying a woman a full soldier's pension. They couldn't imagine, they wouldn't accept, that a woman, a black woman, had done what Tubman had done. It took 30 years. In 1890, after her husband died, Tubman was finally granted a widow's pension of $8 per month based on her husband's service. In 1899, Congress increased it to $20 per month, $8 for the widow's pension, plus $12 for her service as a nurse. But they never officially recognized her as a scout and spy. $20 a month for a woman who'd freed over 70 people on the Underground Railroad, who'd conducted military intelligence operations, who'd led the only military raid in American history commanded by a woman during the war. Tubman didn't spend her later years in bitterness. She became an activist for women's suffrage, working alongside Susan B. Anthony and other leaders of the movement. She spoke at conventions. She traveled to give speeches. When someone asked her if she believed women should have the right to vote, she responded, "I suffered enough to believe it." In the 1890s, Tubman's head injury continued to torment her. The headaches were unbearable. She found a doctor in Boston willing to perform brain surgery. The surgeon would have to cut open her skull to try to relieve the pressure and pain. Tubman refused anesthesia. She'd seen soldiers during the Civil War undergo surgery by biting on bullets to endure the pain. So she bit down on a bullet while the surgeon sawed open her skull and operated on her brain. She survived the procedure. In 1896, Tubman established the Harriet Tubman Home for the aged on property adjacent to her own home. She spent her last years caring for elderly black people, many of them formerly enslaved, who had nowhere else to go. In 1911, she was so poor she had to move into the home herself. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, at the home she'd founded. She was about 91 years old. Her last words were from the Gospel of John. "I go away to prepare a place for you." She was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York, alongside her husband, brother, and father. Hundreds of people attended her funeral. On her headstone, they listed her accomplishments: heroine of the Underground Railroad, nurse and scout in the Civil War, servant of God, well done. In the centuries since her death, Harriet Tubman has become one of the most iconic figures in American history. But for too long, she's been reduced to a sanitized symbol. The Underground Railroad conductor, nothing more. That version of Tubman is safe. It's palatable. It doesn't threaten anyone. The real Harriet Tubman was a guerrilla fighter who carried a pistol and wasn't afraid to use it. She was a military intelligence operative who recruited spy networks and conducted operations behind enemy lines. She was a commander who led troops in combat. She was a tactical genius who outmaneuvered slave catchers and Confederate forces for over a decade. She did all of this despite a disability that could have killed her at any moment. She did all of this despite living in a country that told her she was property, that she wasn't fully human, that she had no rights. She did all of this despite facing betrayal, capture, torture, or death with every mission. She proved that liberation isn't given, it's taken. She proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. She proved that one person, no matter how small, no matter how disadvantaged, can change the course of history. In 2021, the United States Army inducted Harriet Tubman into the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. She joined 278 members, only 17 of them women, honored for intelligence work and special operations leadership. It took 158 years, but the Army finally recognized what she'd done. Plans are underway to feature Harriet Tubman on the redesigned $20 bill, making her the first woman and first African American on U.S. paper currency. There are national historical parks dedicated to her in Maryland and New York. There are statues, memorials, schools, and streets bearing her name. But here's what Harriet Tubman would probably want you to remember most. Every person she freed one at a time. Every risk she took because someone's freedom was worth it. Every battle she fought because She believed in a future where all people could be free. She lived that belief. She risked everything for it. And in the end, she won. Harriet Tubman didn't just lead people out of slavery. She led a war against slavery itself. And she never ran her train off the track. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.